record button. I'd like to welcome everybody to the Iowa State University Dairy Team Dairy Webinar. It's a monthly production. This event is going to talk about extra labor drug use in dairy cattle and specifically how aspirin fits in. Today's presenter is Allison Vander Plaats. She is a postdoctoral associate at Iowa State University Veterinary Field Services. We have had her present on several different topics and always enjoy the presentation. So Allison, as I always say, the podium is yours.
Thank you, Fred, for that introduction. As Fred mentioned, today we'll be covering extra label drug use in cattle, though many of the things that we will be covering today also apply to other livestock species. We'll also touch on aspirin, as this has been sort of an ongoing issue, and how that falls into our regulatory drug framework. So understanding drug labels and marketing categories can be very, very confusing. As we go through this presentation today, think about your previous experience with drug use or interpreting labels and where you didn't feel totally confident. And hopefully by the end, you'll have a better understanding of the different drug classifications, extra label drug use, and what resources are available to help you make sense of all of these different things. So our objectives today: become familiar with what information is on a drug label, identify approved versus unapproved drugs, understand what constitutes extra label drug use, and understand extra label drug use requirements. And I want to give a little bit of background on to how we got onto this topic. So there is a current situation happening all over the US, but primarily centered in California at this time, of highly pathogenic avian influenza in dairy cattle. Farmers were seeing fevers up to 107 degrees Fahrenheit. They're seeing thick brown yellow milk, decreased feed intake, and therefore decreased rumination, and therefore decreased milk because those cows aren't getting the feed that they need to support that milk production. We're also seeing various types of manure, dry to diarrhea, but one of our underlying clinical signs is dehydration, kind of as a result of all of these things. Cows who aren't eating aren't going to go get water after milking. If they're not milking very much, they're not going to be drinking as much water anyway. So dehydration kind of underlies all of these things. As of yesterday, there were 866 dairy herds affected across the nation, with 645 of those being in California. So this issue of high path has really affected our California dairy industry, which makes up a huge portion of our overall nationwide industry. But we've seen high path here in Iowa as well. As I mentioned, one of the biggest issues with these cows is they become dehydrated. So our primary treatments for these cows has centered around fluid therapy or rehydration, trying to maintain that hydration level. And especially for those cows that have those really high fevers, we have also seen a lot of non-steroidal anti-inflammatory use, or NSAID use. There are 3 NSAIDs that are used or popular within our dairy industry. One is flunixin-meglumine, one is meloxicam, and one is aspirin. We will be touching a little bit on each of those things, but it's important for us to kind of differentiate between these categories kind of from the start here. So flunixin-meglumine is a prescription product, and it is FDA approved for veterinary use. Meloxicam is approved for both uses in humans and animals, but not specifically cattle. So that will kind of fit into our extra label drug use discussion. And aspirin is actually not FDA approved at all and never has been. This became a really big sticking point because aspirin is one of those things that has been around forever, as in it predates the FDA, which is our drug regulatory agency. And it has been used in kind of small volumes for a very long time. We now have those other 2 NSAID products that I mentioned that they work better and are actually approved for cattle. So we have, as an industry, sort of moved away from aspirin use, but with this high path issue, and just the volume of sick cows that we're seeing, aspirin has had sort of a resurgence. So it's been used a lot in these California dairies because it is a non-steroidal anti-inflammatory, and it has been easy to incorporate that aspirin powder into the drenches that are being drenched to all of our sick cows. However, because it is unapproved, as in it has never gone through the FDA approval process, it is actually illegal to use it in cattle because extra label drug use does not apply to unapproved drugs. And that seems confusing. So we're going to go through kind of how we got to this point, or kind of what our drug categories are. In October, FDA released this letter after a couple months of our California outbreak. So California broke with high path at the end of August, and FDA released this letter on October 11, 2024. This is one of their Dear Veterinarian letters that are really written for veterinarians to help guide appropriate use of medications. And this is one of a couple for cattle, but if you go to their website, they're sort of written by species. So this starts, Dear Veterinarian, the U.S. Food and Drug Administration understands that veterinarians and dairy farmers may be treating lactating dairy cattle for pyrexia and pain with aspirin, and wants to clarify that there are no FDA-approved aspirin products for use in cattle. The extra label use of unapproved drugs in food-producing species is prohibited. There are FDA-approved products for controlling pyrexia and pain in lactating dairy cattle that are safe, effective, and have established milk and meat withdrawal periods. All FDA-approved animal products are required to carry one of the following statements on the label. This is really important. Approved by FDA under NADA number whatever, or approved by FDA under ANADA number whatever. We'll talk about what each of those means, but those statements will be on every single approved veterinary drug. So if you go pick up a bottle of whatever that is approved today, it will have either an NADA number or an ANADA number on that label. The letter continued, under the Animal Medicinal Drug Use Clarification Act, also known as AMDUCA, veterinarians may use FDA-approved human or animal drugs in food-producing species under specific conditions, which we will discuss in a moment. There is one FDA-approved human aspirin product, Vazalore, that is currently marketed, although other human aspirin products are marketed under an over-the-counter monograph. That monograph is not an approval, and therefore these products cannot be used in an extra label manner. Given the impracticality of dosing cattle with a sufficient amount of the approved human product, the FDA understands that veterinarians and dairy farmers may instead be using unapproved aspirin products that are not legally marketed. The extra label use of unapproved drug products in food-producing species is prohibited. And then it goes on to talk a little bit about our approved products, and for animals that have been treated with aspirin, we want to use prolonged meat and milk withdrawals. So let's talk a little bit about our drug categories. I've already mentioned the NADA and the ANADA number, but this table shows how we think about drug marketing categories. We have prescription drugs, which you may see abbreviated RX, or many of those product inserts will have an RX symbol at the top of that paper. We have over-the-counter products, and we have veterinary feed directive products, which are fed in feed. We also have unapproved products, which we have gotten a little bit of an introduction to. But most of what we use in bovine medicine and most of livestock medicine are prescription products. So these will have a new animal drug application, or NADA, or abbreviated new animal drug application, ANADA number. The NADA is given to the pioneer drug. So whichever company sponsors the original version of that drug, they have the NADA. And then once it becomes generic, those generics will have an ANADA number on them. These drugs must be obtained with veterinary prescription. So that means a licensed veterinarian has prescribed that product. On the label of these products, you will see this statement: caution, federal law restricts this drug to use by or on the order of a licensed veterinarian. So prescription products include all antimicrobials, especially since GFI 263 has taken effect. It also includes NSAIDs, the nonsteroidal anti-inflammatory drugs that we have been talking about thus far, as well as reproductive hormones. So those are prescription products. Another one of our product categories is over-the-counter products, which may be abbreviated OTC. These will also have a NADA or ANADA number associated with them. Again, the NADA is going to be for the pioneer drug, and the ANADA will be for any generics that follow. These do not require veterinary prescription, and they may be obtained at feed or animal supply stores or online. These may include antiparasitics, anthelmintics, so our dewormer products, growth promoting implants, and then most injectable and oral nutritional supplements like probiotics, as well as non-antibiotic topical treatments. Our third category are veterinary feed directive or VFD drugs. These will also have an NADA or ANADA number. These also require veterinary prescription, and these products will have the phrase, caution, federal law restricts medicated feed containing this veterinary feed directive drug to use by or on the order of a licensed veterinarian. As a veterinarian, I basically sign off that, yes, this client can feed this drug. I have to put a period of time that they're feeding that drug. I have to put a concentration of drug that is to be added to the feed. That information is sent to a feed mill who then will follow through on actually giving the client that drug. Finally, we have our unapproved category. So these drugs will not have an NADA or ANADA number on their label, on their accompanying paperwork, on their outer packaging. You may see a national drug code or NDC number, which is very easy to confuse with the NADA number. These drugs have not gone through the FDA approval process. The labeler or the company that's sponsoring that product does submit a bunch of information to FDA that talks about the labeling that is going to be on that package, the actual packaging requirements, as well as where and how it's manufactured. But just because it has an NDC number does not mean it has been FDA reviewed or approved. So these drugs are subject to what we call regulatory discretion. There are a small number of unapproved drugs that we do use in bovine practice. One example would be epinephrine. They're not FDA approved, but since we're usually using them for an individual animal or one at a time, that use is sort of glossed over. However, for our aspirin situation, it's unapproved, and we are now concerned about milk and meat residues in this very widespread use of aspirin. So we're going to look at some labels together, and this is what we're looking for on these labels. We're looking for an NADA or ANADA number, which indicates FDA approval. We're looking at the drug name. Some drugs will have a trade name, which is usually the pioneer drugs, but many generics also have their own trade name. That will be the name that the company has given that drug. You will also see the generic name or the active ingredient of the drug on there. It'll have a concentration or how much drug is in each unit of measurement. It'll have an approved species and or production class. So for example, for use in lactating dairy cattle. It'll have indications, which are the reasons that we are allowed to use that drug. Those are the disease processes that the company tested that drug for and proved safety and efficacy for. The label will also include a dose or how much to give, a frequency, how often to give, a route, how to give, and a duration of treatment. So how long do I give it? Labels will also have a withholding period, which is also known as a withdrawal period. And then there will be cautionary statements on there. So let's start with one of our approved non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs. This is an injectable version of flunixin meglumine. So this is a product that is labeled for cattle. If we look at the top here, you can see a little friend, NDC 55529000604. So that number indicates that this company has given the FDA a whole bunch of information about its labeling and manufacturing and what's in this drug. But we also see right under the big words, approved by FDA under ANADA 200-308. So this is a generic drug. It has that A in front of it, and it has been FDA approved. We know that immediately by looking at this label. Other things we're looking for, this drug actually doesn't have a trade name. It's just called flunixin injection, and the actual drug included is flunixin meglumine. It is a 50 milligram per milliliter concentration, and it has that caution statement that tells us this is also a prescription drug. So caution, federal law restricts this drug to use by or on the order of a licensed veterinarian. We do have the company here at the bottom. We have how much is actually in here, some caution statements, only for intravenous use in beef and dairy cattle, not for use in dry dairy cows and veal calves, and for intravenous and intramuscular use in horses. Before using this drug, read complete package insert. Some of this information, since this is the actual bottle label, so some of this information is not actually included on this bottle label, but this was a nice example because it has both the NDC and the ANADA number associated on the label. In addition, some of the other things that I want to know when I'm looking at a bottle are these residue warnings. This is going to give us information about our withdrawal periods. So cattle must not be slaughtered for human consumption within 4 days of last treatment. So that is a 4-day meat withdrawal. Milk that has been taken during treatment and for 36 hours after last treatment must not be used for food. So that is a 36-hour milk withdrawal. Not for use in dry dairy cows, and a withdrawal period has not been established in pre-ruminating calves. Don't use in calves to be processed for veal, and approved only for intravenous administration. Intramuscular administration has resulted in violated residues in the edible tissues of cattle sent to slaughter. And we have some storage conditions. So on this label, I know immediately, what is this drug? What is the concentration of this drug? Is this drug approved? Is this drug an over-the-counter or prescription product? Who can I use this drug for? It doesn't actually say what I can use this for. The indications are not included on this label. We'll look at another example in a minute. And I also know my withdrawal periods. This is a copy or part of, anyway, a similar product, but this is part of the package insert. So it's a little bit different formatting. You can find these online through the Compendium of Veterinary Products. So every single product, I usually go to Valley Vet because theirs is easiest to find. So this product is Banamine, and it has the little R next to it. So that is our trade name. That is the company's pioneer product. It is made by Intervet Merck Animal Health, and it is approved under FDA under NADA number 101479. So since it's that NADA, this is our pioneer product. This was the first version of this drug available. You can also see directly under that name, we have that little RX symbol. So even though we don't have that cautionary statement about under order by a licensed veterinarian, that little RX tells us that this is still a prescription product. On this packaging, our indications are listed. So for cattle, Banamine is indicated for the control of pyrexia associated with bovine respiratory disease, endotoxemia, and acute bovine mastitis. Banamine is also indicated for the control of inflammation in endotoxemia. So to translate that into easier to understand terms, Banamine is indicated for the control of fever associated with respiratory disease, endotoxemia, and mastitis. It's also indicated for control of inflammation. This is a non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drug. We are primarily using these for pain management as well as inflammation management. Notice pain is not on this label. That's an important point that we'll talk about in a moment. So if I'm using this drug only by the label, I can use it for fever and inflammation, specifically for those listed disease processes. Also on this paper, I have my dose and administration information. So use within 28 days of first puncture. If I go down to cattle, recommended dose for control of pyrexia associated with bovine respiratory disease and endotoxemia and control of inflammation is 1.1 to 2.2 milligrams per kilogram of body weight given by slow intravenous injection either once a day as a single dose or divided into 2 doses administered at 12-hour intervals for up to 3 days. So that is all of my dosing information right there. I have the actual dose, so 1.1 to 2.2 mg per kg, which equals 1 to 2 milliliters per 100 pounds. I have the how often I should give it, either as a single dose or divided into 2 doses given every 12 hours. I have my duration, up to 3 days, and I have my route, slow intravenous administration. I've cut off the rest of this, but this has a little bit different information than what was on the exact bottle label of our last example. I have one more example. It's still the same thing. It's still flunixin, but this is a different formulation of it. So this is Banamine transdermal. So again, we have our trade name as Banamine. It has a little R. That means that it's a registered name. Transdermal, so a different formulation because our last one was an injectable formulation. It still has that little RX that tells us it's a prescription product, so it's only available from a veterinarian. And it has FDA under NADA number 141450. So this is a different NADA number 141450 versus 101479 because this is a different product. Even with the same ingredient, this is also a Pioneer product. This transdermal formulation is the Pioneer product. And it tells us immediately this is a pour-on for beef and dairy cattle. We have our concentration. We have the drug class actually available on this paperwork, so non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drug. We also have that caution statement that tells us it's a prescription drug. Federal law restricts this drug to use by or on the order of a licensed vet. It tells us about some of the other ingredients in this particular formulation, as well as the indications. Banamine transdermal pour-on is indicated for the control of pyrexia associated with bovine respiratory disease. That's the same. And acute bovine mastitis. That's the same as the injectable. And the control of pain associated with foot rot in beef cattle 2 months of age and older and dairy cattle. So this drug actually has different label indications. This has that pain language on there. So if I'm really looking for a drug that's perfect for pain associated with foot rot, this is the one I would choose. It's written right on the label. That is what it is meant for. That is what the company proved safety and efficacy for when it went through that FDA approval process. Now let's go to our other friend, aspirin. So when we look at this label, we're looking for the same things. Right away, we see an NDC number at the top. But then if we look at the rest of this label, there is no NADA or ANADA number on this label. So right away, we know that it is not FDA approved. However, we still have all that other information available to us, minus one important thing. So we have our company, the name, the actual drug, the concentration. So this is 240 grains. This is an aspirin powder or bolus, excuse me. These are 240 grain boluses. They have classified it as both an analgesic, so pain control, as well as an antipyretic, fever control. It does say for animal use only, so I shouldn't use this in people, but I don't see any sort of prescription statement that says this should be used under the direction of a veterinarian. I do have some indications to be used orally as an aid in reducing fever and in relief of minor muscular aches and joint pains in cattle and horses. I do have some dosage information. Mature horses and cattle administer orally 1 to 3 boluses 2 to 3 times daily. Lubricate, administer the ball and gun, allow animals ample supply of fresh, clean water after administration. And then I have a little bit of ingredient information and storage information. So things that are missing from this label that I would really like to have would be, well, I do have a dose. 2 to 3 times daily is a little, 1 to 3 boluses 2 to 3 times daily is a little wide. But I don't have a withhold period anywhere on this label. I don't have that NADA number or ANADA number anywhere on this label. And I also don't have any cautionary statement. So I don't know if there's any classes of animals I really shouldn't be using this in. So this is an example of an unapproved drug label. Again, this is very confusing, right? Because these NDC numbers at the top look a lot like these NADA numbers down here, okay? But what we're really looking for is that approved by FDA under NADA or ANADA number. If that is not on this label, it is not an approved drug. So now that we kind of understand that a little bit better, let's talk about what does extra label drug use actually mean. We just spent a few minutes looking at actual drug labels. We talked a little bit about actual label indications. We talked a little bit about actual label dosages and routes of administration. So what is extra label drug use? As that FDA letter mentioned, the Animal Medicinal Drug Use Clarification Act, or AMDUCA, was passed in 1994. This act empowered veterinarians to use approved drugs for extra label indications with the following limitations. 1, extra label drug use can only be directed by a veterinarian. As a producer, I cannot decide that I'm just going to use a drug in a different way, unless a veterinarian has told me that that is okay and given me kind of more information to use that drug appropriately in an extra label manner. So it has to be directed by a licensed vet within the context of a valid veterinary client-patient relationship. So that means I, as a veterinarian, understand the producer's operation. I understand the flow of animals. I understand the health processes that are in place. I have been on that farm in the last 6 to 12 months. Some of that is state dependent. Extra label drug use may be allowed when the health of the animal is threatened or non-treatment will result in suffering or death. So I cannot decide to use a drug in an extra label manner if I think, you know what, I'll get a little extra weight on this calf if I use this drug. Extra label drug use is not allowed solely for production purposes. It really is for health or suffering/death. 3, I can use drugs in an extra label manner if there are no drugs labeled for such use. So let's use the pain indication as an example. Let's pretend we're back pre-Banamine transdermal. If you look at the indications for our nonsteroidal anti-inflammatories, you would not see the word pain in any of those labels. But we know that animals who are in pain are suffering. So therefore, we would be able to use other nonsteroidal anti-inflammatories that are approved for pain management in those animals. We can also use drugs extra labelly when approved drugs are available, but those labeled drugs have proven ineffective. So let's say I have a specific bug that I've previously treated 10 other calves with drugs that have that label, but I have not been able to successfully treat that disease. That would be an example. The drug is unavailable in the needed dosage form. The drug is unavailable in the required concentration. Those are a little bit harder to justify. We have quite a bit of flexibility with some of our dosing, but as we'll talk about in a minute, changes in dosing is actually an extra label drug use. So that needed dosage form and required concentration can simply be, well, I don't want to give a 10 mg per kg dose. I want to give a 15 mg per kg dose, for example. Extra label drug use is only allowed for FDA approved human and animal drugs. So if the drug has not been approved ever, we cannot use it in an extra label manner. And this is the sticking point with aspirin. It is not approved. We have approved labeled drugs for fever control in cattle. So we should be using those drugs. We don't even have an excuse for extra label drug use of aspirin because it's not approved. Prolonged withdrawal times are applied to avoid violative residues. So if I do change my dose route or my frequency or the amount that I'm giving, then I may need to adjust my withdrawal times because I'm introducing a different amount of drug or maybe in a different way than the way that the company tested and calculated those withdrawal periods with. So these are our options for extra label drug use. Extra label drug use can mean using the drug for different indications, so indications that are not on the label, using drugs at a different dose than the label, using drugs at a different route than the label, so rather than subcutaneous, I use it IM, using drugs at a different duration than the label, so maybe I extend my dosing period, using drugs at different frequency than the label. Maybe instead of giving it every 3 days, I give it every day. So those are all examples of how we change what's written on that drug label and use them in an extra label manner. AVMA has put together an extra label drug use algorithm. AVMA is our American Veterinary Medical Association. They understand that this whole thing is very confusing. So they have put together, it's actually an interactive algorithm. So with a specific case in mind, you can go and answer these questions. But the American Association of Swine Vets has put together this nice single page version of it. So we start at the top. Is there a labeled drug for food animals that contains the needed ingredient in the proper dosage form, labeled for the indication, and is clinically effective? If yes, you have to use the drug that is labeled by label directions. If not, then we ask the question, is there an approved drug or food animal drug that could be used extra label? So is there a drug out there that would work for this condition, but just doesn't have that disease on the label? If yes, you're going to use that drug in an extra label manner. If no, is there an approved human or non-food animal drug, so companion animal drug usually, that could be used extra label? If yes, then we ask the question, can an effective withdrawal time be established? If yes, then we can use that and use our prolonged withdrawal period. If no, If we cannot figure out how long that drug is actually in the body or when it is eliminated from the body, we can't use that drug, or you can use that drug, but that treated animal can never enter the food supply, which for our food producing species is usually the end goal. So that is quite limiting there. Okay, you can use this drug, but this animal will need to be euthanized at the end of its life and disposed of properly. It will never be able to go to slaughter. Or milk harvested from that animal. One of the questions that comes up with this then is, okay, I want to use this drug in an extra label manner. How do I actually figure out then what withdrawal periods to use? Well, FAIRAD, which is our Food Animal Residue Avoidance Data Bank, is a helpful resource. Their website has a little form that we can fill out with all the information about that patient, all the information about the drug that we're using, including the dose, route, duration, frequency, the exact formulation that we're using, because that can make a difference. And FAIRAD essentially looks at all the available literature as well as some mathematical models to come up with what they feel is an appropriate withdrawal time. That being said, they do often recommend that you follow up with testing for that drug, looking for residues before sending either that animal to slaughter or harvesting milk for human consumption, just to make sure that, you know, their predictions were correct and we don't end up with an accidental residue. There are, however, a few drugs where extra label drug use has other rules associated with it. So the fluoroquinolone class of antibiotics, which includes Baytril, Advocin, and Prodilex, has no extra label drug use allowed. So what does that mean? If you actually look at the indications for Baytril, what disease processes are included, Baytril 100 is indicated for the treatment of bovine respiratory disease associated with Mannheimia hemolytica, Pasteurella multocida, Histophilus somni, and Mycoplasma bovis in beef and non-lactating dairy cattle, and for the control of the same. So essentially, if you have a calf with foot rot, you cannot use Baytril because that is extra label drug use. We're using it for different indications than on the label, and that is considered illegal for that fluoroquinolone class. Another example of this, or another special case of this, is the cephalosporin antibiotics. So that includes our ceftiofur sodium, which most people know as Naxal, but there is a generic called Ceftaflex available, Axanel, or generic Cefenil, or Exceed. So you can use cephalosporins for different indications than what's on the label. However, you must follow the label dose, the label route, and the label duration and frequency. So most of these cephalosporins are for respiratory disease, and then some of them have other indications for metritis or for foot rot. So if I want to use this, for example, in a septic calf that has bacteria spreading all throughout its body, and I'm trying to prevent that from killing this calf, I can use essentially any of these as long as I follow the dose, route, duration, and frequency that is printed on that product's label. So those two are really the only ones that have rules associated with them. There are some prohibited classes of drugs in food animal species that I'm not going to talk about today, but do be aware that those are out there. FAIRAD has a nice list of them on their website. So here's another example for a cow with pyelonephritis caused by E. coli. So she has this terrible kidney infection. We do not have any labeled drugs for bovine kidney infection, but we do know that both ceftiofur and gentamicin are good choices for E. coli pyelonephritis, or could be good clinical choices. However, we're not going to use gentamicin because it's of the aminoglycoside class. These drugs stay in kidney tissue for 18 months. So unless someone is willing to hold on to that animal, no questions asked, for 18 months to 2 years, we cannot realistically use gentamicin. So that leaves ceftiofur, one of those, as a good clinical treatment option. If we look at Exceed, for example, which is one of our longest acting ceftiofur formulations, that is our ceftiofur crystalline-free acid. If we look at our indications and our dosage, our indications include treatment of bovine respiratory disease associated with Mannheimia hemolytica, Pasteurella multocida, Histophilus somni in beef, non-lactating dairy and lactating dairy cattle, as well as treatment of bovine foot rot associated with Fusobacterium necrophorum, as well as treatment of acute metritis associated with multiple bacterial organisms. So those are our indications. Pyelonephritis is not on that label, or cattle kidney infection is not on that label. So if we look at, okay, I still want to use this. I think, the susceptibility checks out. Can I legally use this? If I give it by subcutaneous injection in the posterior aspect of the ear where it attaches to the head, also known as the base of the ear, and I follow this dosage of 3 milligrams ceftiofur equivalents, body weight or per pound, so that equals 1.5 mils per 100 pounds of body weight, and I give it as a single subcutaneous injection, then I can use this drug. If I decide I want to change how to give it, like, oh man, well, I can't adequately restrain that cow to give this at the base of ear, or I don't think that'll be enough, I really want to give more, then I cannot use these ceftiofurs. I have to go to something else then. So we've talked a little bit about antibiotics and how those kind of apply. I did mention meloxicam at the top of this lecture, and meloxicam is an important tool in our cattle veterinarian toolbox. Per AMDUCA, per that law, meloxicam extra label drug use is allowed to alleviate pain, suffering, and discomfort. And we usually use this in a kind of processing situation. So during castration or during disbudding, or, well, those are our two most common probably. We don't have drugs that are labeled for pain and inflammation management or to alleviate pain, suffering, and discomfort associated with some of these conditions. So under AMDUCA, we are allowed to use meloxicam for these reasons. Number one, meloxicam is actually approved for dogs and cats. So we do have veterinary versions of this drug available, just not labeled for cattle. And if you look at this, this is an example of the dog oral suspension. We also see the NDC number at the top here. But if you look at the bottom, and I know it's very small, we also have an NADA number down there. So we know that it's veterinary approved, or we know that it's FDA approved, excuse me. We have both an oral suspension and an injection available for other veterinary patients. However, meloxicam is also approved for use in humans, and we have oral suspensions, oral tablets, and oral capsules available. This is an example of the human package of meloxicam, and this is literally the brand that is in my truck today. At the top, you see an NDC number, which we know really doesn't tell us very much. But if you look at the rest of this bottle, there is not an NADA or ANADA number. That is because this is not an animal formulation of this drug, but it's also because human drugs have different rules than veterinary drugs do. And that's very confusing. However, because it's both approved as an animal version and a human version, I could theoretically choose either one of those. I don't have an approved version for other food producing animals where I would use that one first. So I could theoretically use either of these products for use in calves if I wanted to. So our bottom line question is, how do I know? And the answer for veterinary drugs is it's actually pretty simple for you to figure out if this is an approved veterinary drug. FDA put out this press release on April 1, 2024. As of 2018, all veterinary drugs are required to have these statements: approved by FDA under NADA number or approved by FDA under ANADA number. So if it is an approved veterinary drug, it will, on its packaging, on the outer packaging and on the bottle and on the package insert, have an NADA or an ANADA number associated with it. If you're still not sure, or you've lost those things, or the label is unreadable or whatever, they do have an online repository or an online database of every approved drug ever, and every unapproved drug too. For the animal version, it's called Animal Drugs at FDA. This is what it looks like. There is a search box here. You can search by trade name, you can search by generic name, you can search by active ingredient, you can search by NADA or ANADA number, okay? And it'll come up with all of those things. You may also see this referred to as the Green Book. It used to be a printed book, but today it's all available digitally. On this website, they also have a number of other interesting resources if you're interested in the regulations surrounding drugs. For human drugs that are approved that I'm trying to use in an extra label manner, they might, but probably won't, have what's called an NDA or ANDA number. So that is national or a new drug application number or abbreviated new drug application number. So these are missing the A. So new animal drug application. This is just new drug application since these are human drugs. Most of them will not have this printed on the package. They will have the NDC number. That's part of the required labeling, but only certain human drugs will actually have their NDA or ANDA number printed on the package. So that is really confusing because I've already told you NDC numbers, it's essentially a way for FDA to keep track of what exists, but NDC does not mean it is approved. So how do you actually figure out if a human drug is approved? Well, there is a human version called drugs at FDA. It looks like this. This is me searching for meloxicam, looking for all the human approved formulations of meloxicam. And they have similar things. You can search by trade name, you can search by generic name, you can search by active ingredient, or you can search by the NDA or ANDA numbers if you know them. So using the human drugs in an extra label manner is a little bit more challenging because you just have to be aware that they don't have the same labeling requirements that we do. And just because an NDC number is on there does not actually mean it's FDA approved. So in summary, because that was a lot, we use all sorts of drugs in bovine and livestock medicine. All of those drugs are regulated by FDA. They are our drug regulatory body, make sure things are safe and efficacious and that no one is misrepresenting themselves or misrepresenting claims for those drugs that they're producing. We have discussed what is on a drug label and what those things mean and how to actually look for them and interpret them. And we have also talked about how to identify whether both human and animal drugs are FDA approved and the limitations for using unapproved drugs, particularly in food producing species, which specifically is we cannot legally do that. So that is all I have prepared. I'd be happy to take questions at this time.
Thank you very much, Dr. Vander Plaats. We appreciate the information you brought to us. If folks have questions, we've got a small group here. Go ahead and unmute and ask or type it in. We have one question from Amanda. If a farmer is using aspirin for pain medication for dehorning calves before 8 weeks of age, is it no longer acceptable to do that?
Yeah, so Amanda, it's actually never been acceptable to do that, but because of the previous small use of aspirin or small volume use of aspirin, it was not really an issue. There are other options available, including both Banamine and meloxicam that are both legal under either label or extra label indications. So we usually use meloxicam for that. It's easy to give. Just put a couple pills in their little mouth, let them suck them off your finger.
Okay, we've got one question in. Who is policing the violators, both on the producer side or the pharmaceutical firm side, or is this the Wild West?
Yeah, that is a tough question to answer, Fred, because right now there isn't policing happening. FDA did release this statement that aspirin is not legal for use and we need to move to labeled or other legal extra label uses. But they also understand that there's a transition period between you guys have been using aspirin for a long time because it's been available and on shelves and no one really understands FDA drug approval regulations to now we're banning it and we're going to come after you. So right now we're in that transition period where they're not looking for it, but they're working on it and it's still on the shelves, but they're working on it.
Okay. How will producers know if and when aspirin becomes an approved drug?
Unless a company decides to put up the time and money and energy to take aspirin through the FDA approval process, it will not just magically become an approved drug. So This takes millions of dollars and years, basically going through a bunch of studies to prove that aspirin is both safe and efficacious. Unfortunately, because aspirin is what it is, which is a pretty cheap, readily available, but maybe not super duper effective drug for managing pain, I would be highly doubtful that a particular manufacturing company is going to put up the money and time to take aspirin through this process. So it will not become approved unless someone decides to do that. And maybe this is the impetus for someone to do that, but at this point, I don't know of anyone looking at that.
Sounds like a lot of cost for something
Yeah.
that's not going to return very quickly.
Yep.
You'd mentioned a couple of different times about considering mitigating pain.
Yep.
So when is it, dehorning you mentioned, hoof trimming, tail docking, is that something we should be considering, or when do we consider pain management?
So pain management is one of those things that is kind of a growing area. Livestock species have always experienced pain. We just didn't really pay attention to it until somewhat recently. So particularly for calves, our periods are going to be disbudding. That's going to be a painful period. Castration, that may be a painful period. So ideally, we are using these NSAIDs prior to that painful period. And research kind of depends on what timing is exact. But even if I give a calf some meloxicam and then I disbud her, that is better than not giving her anything at all. That'll keep her a little bit more comfortable. She is quicker to go back to feed, quicker to get up and get going. As far as tail docking goes in cattle, we don't do that anymore unless there's a medical need for it. So I did actually do that the other day with one of our calves. She got stepped on by mom right at birth. She had a big broken tail that was bleeding everywhere. So we gave her some meloxicam and banded that tail. And castration for baby calves is done in much the same way. We can band them when they're little, or even when we move to surgical castration, we can use NSAIDs to help with that prolonged pain following castration, either surgical or banding. So it should be done at the time, or ideally slightly before the time of actually doing those procedures. But pain management is really, really important. And we do need more pain management options for our livestock species. I agree with that completely.
Any other questions from the audience? I'm not seeing anything in the chat. I'll give a couple of seconds and then I've got one closing question, actually a clarification, Allison. For our ANADA approved drugs to be used extra label across species. And for instance, I have dairy cows, I also have dairy goats and dairy sheep. I want to use a cow drug in my sheep. Explain that to me.
That itself could be an entire webinar. Small ruminants are considered minor species, so there are special considerations for them, but because we don't have a lot of labeled options for them, most of our drug use in small ruminants is actually extra labeled drug use. So it's sort of the Wild West, sort of. But because their classification as a minor species, they don't contribute economically in the way that beef cattle, dairy cattle, pigs, poultry do. There are some different kind of regulations surrounding them. So I would recommend, if you have questions, you reach out to your herd veterinarian, make sure you have that VCPR and see what they would recommend for specific uses. But there are some special rules. The Baytril thing is still true. We cannot use Baytril in an extra label manner in sheep and goats. But a lot of our drug use is extra label.
Very good. Do you have any closing comments for the audience? Just looking through here, we've got a couple of producers, but a lot of folks from the medical side. Anything you want to share as a closing comment?
Aspirin is not approved, and therefore it is illegal for use in our food producing species unless someone decides to take it through the drug approval process. But we do have other options for, NSAIDs in particular. That was a focus here. And we do have the option to use those in an extra label manner as long as you're working with your veterinarian to make that happen.
Allison, thank you very much for your time. You shared some great information, and folks can see your email there on the screen if they want to ask you questions directly. I'd like to remind folks that this is a monthly program. In January, we've got Dr. Dennis Toddy, he's a climatologist, and he's going to be looking at the 2025 growing season forecast and kind of help us understand what's happening to the climate we're living in. So again, thank you, Allison. Appreciate the program, and thank everybody for being in attendance. Look forward to seeing you next month. Have a great holiday.